Good morning, ACCS. So for today's mini lesson, I want to talk about how understanding the meaning of words and phrases can help us identify the theme or central idea of a text. So we want to remember that our steps for understanding the meanings of words and phrases are: number one, we look to the context, and number two, we combine our background knowledge, what's in the text, and our imaginations to make inferences. We have to use the context to help us understand specific words and phrases, and then based on the text, plus our background knowledge and our imaginations, we have to make an inference about the idea the author is trying to convey. And I really want to highlight the role of imagination in this process. I think that it is underrated. And I just want to remind you guys that making an inference is a creative process. You have to take your background knowledge, what is there, but you also have to realize that, and this is what people mean when they say read between the lines. That's a figurative expression. There's not really anything written between the lines. They mean that you have to use your imagination to fill in the gap. You have the context, you have your background knowledge, and then something's implied, but it's not said explicitly. You have to use your imagination to combine the background knowledge with what is there to fill in that blank space or read between the lines so that you can make the inference. And what's great about knowledge is, or not knowledge, but literature is frequently, the background information and the context is just enough that when you go to fill in the blank, you could potentially fill it in multiple different ways, which is what's so great. And you can have multiple interpretations of literature. You can have multiple themes. So when it comes to the theme itself, we just want to remember that our steps are, we identify the cause and effect sequence of events that takes place throughout the narrative structure. This means that we're going to be looking for the setting, the main characters, the conflict, the resolution, and we know that we're going to get our theme by either asking ourselves, what life lessons do the characters learn by resolving the conflict, or what life lesson do the characters learn from the conflict that doesn't get resolved, depending upon whether or not there is a resolution. So for today, we're looking specifically at chapter 13, and I want to focus a little bit on page 87 of chapter 13 to model how understanding the meanings of words and phrases can help us to identify a theme. So in this chapter, after Mr. Friedman is beaten to death, Maya blames herself for what happens to him. She believes that because she didn't tell the court about the other times that Mr. Friedman touched her, that her lie caused his death. This false belief motivates Maya to quit speaking. And I'm going to make the argument that this is a big deal. I had sold myself to the devil, and there could be no escape. The only thing I could do was to stop talking to people other than Bailey. Instinctively, or somehow, I knew that because I loved him so much, I'd never hurt him. But if I talked to anybody else, that person might die too. Just my breath, carrying my words out, might poison people. I had to stop talking. I discovered that to achieve perfect personal silence, all I had to do was attach myself leech-like to sound. I began to listen to everything. I probably hoped that after I had heard all the sounds, really heard them, and packed them down deep in my ears, the world would be quiet around me. I walked into rooms where people were laughing, their voices hitting the walls like stones, and I simply stood still in the midst of the riot of sound. After a minute or two, silence would rush into the room from its hiding place because I had eaten up all of the sounds. So here, when Maya says she sold herself to the devil, we know that she isn't being literal. By looking at the context, specifically the cause that leads up to the effect of her no longer wanting to speak, we can conclude that Maya is referring to her lying in court. She refers to this lying as selling herself to the devil because she believes that her lie led to Mr. Freeman's death. Imagery, I'll remind you, is any words that excites the reader's senses. Oftentimes we just think about imagery as what makes us see, but imagery is any word that helps you see something clearer or smell something better or feel it more effectively. Any word that does that is called imagery. Maya uses very vivid imagery to explain the extent to which she comes to believe that her words are dangerous to others. She says, quote, "Just my breath, carrying my words out, might poison people," end quote. With the imagery of Maya's breath leaving her body, carrying words that fly through the air and entering another person's ears as poison, Maya makes visible for us an invisible process. We really have to slow down, use our imaginations, and visualize this taking place in order to make the inference that Maya uses imagery to show how she believes her words are evil and poisonous. Probably the most puzzling and interesting part of the quote above is when Maya describes how she goes about becoming silent. She says, quote, "I discovered that to achieve perfect personal silence, all I had to do was attach myself, leech-like, to sound. I began to listen to everything. I probably hoped that after I had heard all the sounds, really heard them and packed them down deep in my ears, the world would be quiet around me. I walked into rooms where people were laughing, their voices hitting the walls like stones, and I simply stood still in the midst of the riot of sound. After a minute or two, silence would rush into the room from its hiding place because I had eaten up all of the sounds," end quote. Maya uses the simile of a leech to describe her focus. I know this because of an inference. When Maya says she attaches herself leech-like to sound, I know that she isn't being literal. No one can attach themselves to sound like a blood-sucking leech attaches itself to a host's body. So I ask myself, what can she really do to get as close to sound as possible so that it's like a leech attaching itself to a person? Well, I can infer that the only way a person can get really close to sound is to focus on it with great intensity. This inference is supported by the context because the next line reads, quote, "I began to listen to everything, all the sounds, really heard them and packed them down deep in my ears," end quote. Maya further describes this intense focus as, quote, "eating up all of the sounds," end quote. Again, I know this can't be literal. No one can eat sound. So I can make the inference that this idea of eating sound must be a figurative way for Maya to describe how she focuses on sound really intensely. She's able not only to silence herself, but to find silence in sound. This is a big, complicated idea, and we could even go so far as to call it one of the themes of the chapter. This idea that something can turn into its opposite, or that opposites are not isolated, separate things, but that they are inner working parts of a process. Sound exists, according to this thinking, because it needs the absence of sound or silence in order to emerge. Maya expresses something similar in regard to space, about inside and outside, because Maya eats or takes into herself all of the outside sounds in order to find and to achieve silence in the outside world. We could extrapolate or take this from one place to another. We could extrapolate this thinking and apply it to lots of things. So think of a painting of a tree, for example. In order to see the tree in the painting, we need the nothingness of the blank space of the page to exist first. So the nothingness and the somethingness, they're not just opposites, they're interdependent. This is a big idea we can only get by way of careful analysis and inference. Still thinking in terms of context, we have to pause for a moment and really think about this section of the text, not just in terms of the context of the paragraph or the context of the chapter, but in the big picture of the whole text. So we know that I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is the creative autobiography of one of the most celebrated American poets of the 20th century, Maya Angelou. It's like the origin story of a superhero. So with that in mind, at this moment, we have to ask ourselves, what is a poet? What does a poet do? The simple answer is a poet uses language and sound to express important feelings and ideas about life. So again, now we ask, since we know I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is the story of how a great poet becomes a great poet, does the part of the story where Maya effectively describes herself taking a vow of silence by letting all of the sounds outside of herself into herself to the point that she moves beyond all noise into an almost spiritual dimension of silence seem like a big deal? And of course, the answer is most likely and most certainly yes. This is a big deal. This, in the origin story of a poet, the moment where she decides to take a vow of silence is huge. A poet deals in sound, deals in language. The fact that part of her origin story involves this moment of this real intimate, interaction between trauma and between sound and between silence and between noise, it's really huge. So we can even read this and make the prediction that the lesson that Maya learns about figuratively eating all the sound until she's able to move beyond sound is going to have a huge impact on her later when she becomes a poet. Not only because of the theme that is expressed here about sound and space, but also because of the theme that is expressed about opposites in general. This interconnectivity between blankness of the page and the tree, or between sound and between silence, or between up and down, left and right. This is to understand these things as processes. We can make that prediction. It's going to have a huge impact upon her as a poet, because poets can move between different dimensions and different scales, different spaces, different moments in history with great fluidity. And this understanding that opposites are not separate, but that they're inner working parts of a process must have been a huge deal for her to learn at the age of 8. So now I'm going to cut you guys loose to continue to read chapter 13 independently and go ahead and look at some of the RL 8.4 questions, or the questions that have to do with the meanings of words and phrases, and with the understanding that, of course, RL 8.4 connects to RL 8.2. Understanding the meanings of words and phrases is only going to help enrich our understanding of the theme or the central idea of the text.